Christian student group on campus, which is interested in engaging McGill students from all backgrounds in their perspectives on worldview and religion. So we organize various events to do just that, such as our UQs, where we seek to encourage McGill students to ask and think about the big questions in life. So tonight our topic is Tolerance Intolerant? And our speaker is Wesley Huff. So Wesley Huff was born in Multan, Pakistan, and spent a portion of his childhood in the Middle East. He has a BA in Sociology from York University, a master's from Tyndale University, and is a PhD student in New Testament at the University of Toronto. After being diagnosed with a rare neurological condition at the age of 11 that left him paralyzed from the waist down, Wes experienced a miraculous recovery that the doctors themselves said they had no medical explanation for. This experience, along with a great deal of study and soul-searching in his later teens, is what solidified his interest in his subjects of faith and engaging the beliefs and worldview perspectives of others. He's been participating in public dialogues on issues of faith, belief, and religion for the last 6 years. So last month, I had the privilege to listen to Mr. Huff speak, and he's a great speaker. He has a lot of smart ideas and a lot of great things to say. So please welcome up Wesley Huff.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Before I start, I just want to show a very quick video.
Das hier ist ein Mein-Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät des Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We're sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Well, I show that as an illustration because the topic tonight is on the issue of tolerance. Specifically, is tolerance intolerant? And a large degree of this conversation has to do with a translation issue, because the culture around us has defined tolerance in a specific way that hasn't necessarily been true throughout history. And just to illustrate this point, when I was involved in my undergrad, specifically in my third year of my program at York University, during one of my tutorials, I stepped into the classroom, and right off the bat, the TA stepped up to the board and she said, "This is a tolerant classroom." And then she wrote this. She said, "Tolerance means that all opinions and ideas are equally valid." Now, what I did next, I don't actually recommend that the vast majority of students do. Because what I did is I went up to the board and I picked up the piece of chalk and I wrote, "Your perspective on tolerance is wrong." Now, I turned around and I said, before you start yelling, before you pick up the tomatoes, I just have one question. And I turned to the TA and I said, "Is that perspective my opinion?" And she said, "Well, yes." And I said, "Okay, if your definition of tolerance, that all opinions and ideas are equally valid, and my opinion and perspective is that your definition of tolerance is wrong, what does that mean for your definition of tolerance?" You know, it's interesting that tolerance is something that is often used in our society as a positive, but it's framed as a negative. The dictionary definition of tolerance is literally to allow or permit the existence, occurrence, or practice of something that you do not agree with or like without inference. Tolerance means that I accept you at your expense. It's actually a very negatively wrapped term. It means I'm claiming something about myself that's good for being tolerant, but I'm doing so at your expense. The classical definition of tolerance is to imply disagreement with something or someone. Otherwise, you're just agreeing with it. There's nothing to tolerate. And there are two ways, in dealing with this virtue, which shows that they're conceptually different, but pragmatically the same. Let me give you an illustration of this. This evening, earlier, I had the privilege of having supper with a number of students. Now, let's say after this talk, you find me and you heard that I went out for supper with Daniel. And you asked, oh, Wes, I heard you went out for supper with Daniel. I heard it was Daniel's favorite restaurant. What did you think of the food? And my answer, if it was, well, I could tolerate it, that wouldn't be a positive. Let's say Daniel, even worse, was around the corner listening to our conversation. And after that question, you asked, well, what do you think of Daniel? He's a great guy, right? If my response was, he's tolerable, do you think that Daniel would invite me back to McGill to speak at the next ultimate question session? Probably not. We use it in our culture, this value and idea of being tolerant. But the fact is, while we define it positively, pragmatically, we often use it as a negative. The Oxford English Dictionary has something like 22 different definitions for the word tolerance. If there are any engineering students in the audience, you'll know that the definition of tolerance in engineering is a building or structure's ability to handle something before its eventual collapse. Likewise, medical tolerance is your ability to fight off some unwanted disease before your body finally gives in. We talk of pain tolerances. It's your ability to handle something that you dislike. Likewise, in society, tolerance, as I mentioned, is often used as a positive, but it's pragmatically defined in a negative. Tolerance is in fact something that is negative. Tolerance means, as I said, I accept you at your expense. If you were to enter a university classroom and the professor was to say something like, we need to tolerate the black people in the room today, I think that would realistically give you a response that's somewhat cringeworthy. Respect, on the other hand, means that I disagree with you, but there's something about you that demands that I treat you in a particular way, which is to your benefit because you, as an individual, as a human being, possess intrinsic worth. Our culture has bought into this false definition of tolerance, I think, because it's bought into a number of false ideals in our society. Two specifically that I want to outline in order to explain what I mean with how we misunderstood tolerance. The first ideal that I think we misunderstood is the idea of freedom. Within the world that we live in, we often define freedom as the absence of constraint, literally doing whatever you want, whenever you want to, however you want to do it. But that isn't freedom. Freedom can only exist within a moral framework. There are places around the world that you can go to where you can do whatever you want, whenever you want to, and however you want to do it. But those are generally safe places. In fact, that definition of freedom is not freedom, but rather anarchy. And now let me create a visual for you, because I think the ultimate illustration of freedom as absence of constraint would be to imagine an astronaut floating in space, free of all forms of external constraints, and yet powerless to move. If the astronaut wants to move, he or she must make contact with an external reality outside of themselves against which they can push off of. Right? Have you ever been in your car at a stoplight and the car beside you started to move and you lost your bearings and pushed harder on the brake thinking that you were moving? How do you gain a reference point? Well, you look at something that is external to you. You look at something that is immovable, like a tree or a building. But that is still a constraint that allows you to be free. Now, there's a specific illustration that this reminds me of in terms of a quote by the inventor of the internal combustion engine, Henry Ford. He said any customer can have a car painted in any color that he or she wants, so long as it is black. It's the illusion of freedom. Society will want to say that freedom is lack of any moral or constraint. They will want to push that agenda. But the very same people, rather, will want to give us an illusion that we have options, that we are free to make our own decisions. We are told to think outside of the box, but only as long as the outside of the box fits snug into the inside of society's box. It's the illusion of being given an option, having a car in any color you want, as long as it's black. This is how the pastor and theologian Tim Keller puts it. He says, why is freedom so important? Why is that the absolute, unquestionable good? And who gets to define it as such? Are you not assuming a value-laden standard that you are using to critique all other approaches to life? Are you not then actually giving a universal answer to the meaning question? Namely, that the meaning of life is to have the freedom to determine your own meaning? Are you not then doing the very thing the very thing you say should not be done? We bought into a false definition of freedom, which has bled into the way that we look at the issue of tolerance. Now, I think the second thing I want to highlight is the idea and concept of truth. Now, I think this is all symptomatic, this whole discussion is symptomatic of the world we live in. It comes from the fact that we live in a pluralistic, diverse culture. And Canada is a pioneer of that, of this multicultural idea. Canada is a little snippet, a little picture of the global village of the planet Earth that we live in. And I'm a testament to that fact. As you heard in my introduction, I was born in Pakistan to an Irish by heritage New Zealander-born mother and a Scottish father with a German last name. I spent a portion of my childhood in the Middle East and my teenage years in Northern Ontario. There are dozens of different examples that we can use of how we are all a little picture of diversity, of this idea of multiculturalism and pluralism. Now, this is testified to the fact that there are all these isms around us, right? There's Buddhism, there's secularism, there's Hinduism, there's Islamism, there's Judaism. You can even be a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. We call that masochism. The danger, however, is if we let this idea of pluralization and diversity collapse our thinking into convincing us that because there is so much diversity, that there is no real truth and there's no real fact of how to know what truth is. That's because of diversity and religion and opinion and ethnicity. But the fact that we have diversity doesn't mean that there's no ultimate truth, that there's no real ultimate objective in the world. Let me give you a little example of this. A few months ago, I was taking the public transit in Toronto. You can send your condolences through flowers and chocolates. But I was on the train, and there was a woman beside me who was reading this book, Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth. Now, I've read up a little bit on New Age spiritualism, and so I'd actually read Eckhart Tolle. And one of the things I like to do is be a nuisance to other people on public transit. So what I did is I turned to her and I said, excuse me for interrupting, but I wondered what you thought of the book you're reading. And she went on to talk about the book. And at one point she said, I think that my biggest realization, my biggest takeaway so far is the freeing notion and realization that there are no absolutes. To which I said, are you absolutely sure that's your biggest realization? And she said, oh yes, absolutely. And then we both kind of looked at each other because she'd realized that something there doesn't make any sense. And I said, I don't mean to be disingenuous, but you do realize that even saying that there are no absolutes is an absolute statement. Now, the conversation sort of took a turn there. And we talked about a few other things. We talked about the law of non-contradiction, that something can't be that thing and not that thing at the exact same time. I cannot be a married bachelor. That's a logical contradiction. But at one point in the conversation, she said this. She said, but you're just being too hard-lined. In this day and age, we know that truth is relative. Wes, you're just out of touch and out of date. And this is the thinking with a lot of people in our society in terms of how we view truth and how that affects our idea of tolerance. Now, ironically, she got off one station before I did, and when I got off at my station, I walked out, and on the platform was this advertisement. Now, that's a little bit hard to see, but right there it says, creativity is subjective, the truth isn't. Advertising Standards Canada. And immediately I thought, someone needs to phone Advertising Standards Canada and tell them that their view is just out of touch and out of date. You know, we'll give lip service to this idea that there is subjective truth, that there are no absolutes, but deep down, we know that cannot be the case. Truth isn't an ice cream flavor that we can just choose to like or dislike. Truth is much more like insulin to the diabetic. It's just a reality. It's not a preference. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, a man's spirit can be judged by how much truth he can tolerate. You know, truth is not always convenient. I may want to fly. I may even form a cape out of your coats over there, get in the elevator, go to the top of the building, get on the roof, go to the edge, and jump off. But I'm not going to break the law of gravity. The law of gravity is going to break me. That truth is inconvenient to me at that time. You diminish a person's value when you tolerate them according to today's definition. Cultural tolerance, as we define it now, diminishes truth and the value of life, I would argue. If you're truly tolerant, according to today's definition, then why even pursue truth? Why would you even try to convince someone if all values, if all beliefs, if all lifestyles are actually equal? You know, we need to understand that no one is really neutral in this conversation, although a lot of people might assume the position of neutrality. Now, the second that the idea that one worldview perspective is true and others are false is not intolerance, but a simple logical conclusion that any reasonable person, I think, has to come to conclude. A disagreement does not have to mean dissent. And a reason for that fact is testified by the reality that this event is being held in a university. Did you know that the term university in English actually comes from a Latin phrase, universitas magisterium et scholarum diversus, diversity within the community of masters and scholars. The English word university actually comes from the compound words of unity within diversity. This has been celebrated throughout history. Universities have been places where people have been able to come with different opinions, with different values, and sit at the same table, disagreeing with each other, but being respectful in open dialogue. The problem is when we collapse all of this into a view that they all have to be equally true, that they all have to be equally the same. A number of years ago, I found my way in India. I actually had a short-lived Bollywood career. That's an entirely different presentation. But it was this year when I was an extra on a Bollywood movie in New Delhi. And I had found my way, mostly because of a rickshaw driver who went the wrong way, at the Baha'i Grand Lotus Temple in New Delhi, which is one of the largest temples for the Baha'i faith. And if you don't know anything about the Baha'i faith, they hold to the value that all religions are the same, that they're all different paths to God. And as I was there, I was walking around the building, and a young individual came up to me who was originally from California, but he was there as a pilgrim training to be a Baha'i monk. And he came up to me and he said, "Hello, my name is so-and-so, and I'm a Baha'i monk. I'm training to be a Baha'i monk, rather. And I believe that all religions lead to God." I said, "That's very interesting. My name's Wesley. I'm a Christian, and I believe that one way leads to God." And he went, "Oh, no, I can't accept that." And I went, "Hold on. You're excluding me." He went, No, we want to include everyone." But you see, the irony is that even the inclusivists have to exclude the exclusivists. It's just a logical conclusion. There's no such thing as neutral ground and a neutral position, and there really is no such thing as an inclusivistic worldview by that definition. You see, if Jesus is the Messiah, then logically Christianity is true and Judaism is false. But if Jesus is not the Messiah, then Judaism is true and Christianity is false. These are just logical conclusions. Likewise, if God is personal, then Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have the probability of being true, and Hinduism has, by logical order, has to be false. But if we switch it, if God is not personal, then Hinduism has the probability of being true, and Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have the probability of being false. These are just logical conclusions. Let me illustrate this by another story of me interrupting people on the subway. I was on the subway, this was also a number of months back, and there were a number of women who had just come from a book study. And they were reading Deepak Chopra's 3-part series on Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha. And there were 2 women specifically beside me who were holding the books of Buddha and Jesus. So I said, sorry to interrupt, but I saw that you were reading Deepak Chopra. I've also read Deepak Chopra. I was wondering what you thought. And as the conversation progressed, they asked me my opinion, and I shared it. I said, well, I don't think that what Chopra expresses about Jesus actually represents anything we know about the historical character of Jesus. Well, she said, holding that opinion makes you intolerant. And I said, okay, well, what do you mean by that? She said, well, you think your point of view on Jesus is correct and everyone else is wrong, don't you? And I said, yes, but let me ask you this. The beliefs that you hold, they're clearly different than mine. Do you believe that your beliefs are right or wrong? Well, she said, they're absolutely right. I said, okay. And mine are wrong? She said, yes. I said, okay. Well, let me ask you this. Why is it that when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant, but when you think you're right, you're just right? She said, because you're intolerant. Now, that sort of, it brings the whole conversation in a completely different direction. And like the other example of the woman on the subway, it sort of falls apart when you look into it a little bit further. Now, there is an assumption going on here. The assumption is that all religions have an underlying aspect of the truth. And this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but I'm going to talk about it anyways for a little bit. That in that sense, they can be labeled as all the same. All worldview perspectives are the same. Sure, they may differ on God, on heaven, on hell, on meaning, on morality, on destiny and purpose, but those are just the small things, right? They all have some aspect of, let's say, the golden rule. Right? Jesus' words, in everything, therefore, do unto others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets, recorded by Matthew in his biography of Jesus' life, chapter 17. And to some degree, that's true. I've looked into this, and there are other worldviews who have similar sayings. If we look at Buddhism, Buddhism has a mantra, treat not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. Likewise, There's a saying in Hinduism, do not do to others what you would cause pain if done to you. There's even a Zoroastrian proverb that says, do not do unto others whatever is injurious to yourself. And as far as my study goes, the closest I could find to Jesus is Confucius, who said, do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself. They're similar, but I want you to notice the difference. There's a subtle difference in the way that they're worded. Jesus is framed in a positive, where all the others are framed in a negative. There's a big difference between not punching someone in the face and building someone a hospital. It's not the superficiality that matters, it's the fundamental aspect of the disagreement. Let's put it in a different way. Advil and arsenic both come in pill form. But when I have a headache, it's not the similarities within Advil and arsenic that are going to outline my decision to take one or the other. It's the differences. One is going to potentially solve my headache. The other one's going to kill me. It's not the similarities, but the distinctions. Going back to what we were saying before, a belief is a mental activity. It's a mental activity which you hold something to be true. Now, everyone who holds a belief holds that belief because they believe it to be true. They might not realize that it's true. They might not verbalize that it's true, but they themselves believe that it's true. Otherwise, they wouldn't hold it. A belief is a mental activity in which you hold something to be so. Now, if we're talking about the subject of intolerance, if you accuse other people of being tolerant, like the lady on the subway did to me, it's actually an attack on character rather than dealing with the details. The intolerance challenge changes the subject. At the end of the day, it's just politically correct trash talk. It doesn't affect truth. Giving them the benefit of the doubt, I could be intolerant and Jesus could still be the Son of God. My intolerance doesn't change any of the truth. I could be intolerant and still truth be truth. However, if I'm laying out a case for Jesus and substantiating that claim that he is the only way, and then you call me intolerant for that, what you're actually proving is that you can't deal with the claim, so you resort to name calling. There's an actual word for this in philosophy. It's the logical fallacy of ad hominem, a Latin word that just means towards the man. It's an attack on someone's character rather than dealing with the actual arguments, the actual case that they're laying out. Now, when we're talking about tolerance, tolerance is not totally a bad thing. We don't tolerate pedophiles. We don't tolerate murderers. We don't tolerate psychopaths and genocidal megalomaniacs. Dare I say, we don't tolerate the Toronto Maple Leafs. And that's a good thing. We really can't tolerate all behaviors. And a society that shuts down vibrant disagreement and robust debate, as proponents of cultural tolerance want to do, will utterly crumble. The example I gave at the beginning with my TA's definition of tolerance, what she said, would she have said that Holocaust denial was a valid opinion? Or that ethnic cleansing was a valid opinion? Or that the Toronto Maple Leafs are a valid team? I don't think so, based on what we know of those things. When people claim to be tolerant, I like to ask them if they're willing to tolerate the people that they think are intolerant. Now, of course, if they are truly tolerant, then they will have to say yes, whether they like it or not. And if they say no, then it really reveals the inconsistency in their worldview. But once again, I don't know all that many people who want to be tolerated, but I know a lot of people who want to be respected. You know, we've swallowed a false definition of freedom, which has led to confusion on the issue of truth, which has totally altered our modern definition of tolerance. The modern idea of cultural tolerance, although often used in a positive, is definitionally and pragmatically a negative. Now I want to take a sidestep, because I want to argue something that I think is actually true, that only the Judeo-Christian worldview can supply the ingredients and means for what people actually misdefine as what they think is tolerant. Equality and respect and dignity are not secular ideas. They're not secular ideals. They don't spawn from natural materialistic evolution. They have roots in the Christian tradition. Now, we haven't always practiced it well, and as someone within the Christian tradition, I fully admit that. But their ideas find their roots within the idea that we are all created in the image of God and have intrinsic worth. In fact, the UK philosopher and atheist John Gray puts it like this: modern secular humanism, he says, is the faith that through science, humankind can know truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind sees evolutionary success, not truth. To think otherwise is to resurrect the pre-Darwinian error that humans are different from all other animals. This is an atheist talking. We can even get farther than that. Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovit sarcastically summarized the ethical reasoning of secular humanism like this: man descended from apes, therefore love one another. Once again, the pastor, author, and theologian Tim Keller, in commenting about that statement, says the second clause does not follow from the first. If it was natural for the strong to eat the weak in the past, why aren't people allowed to do it now? Given the secular view of the universe, the conclusion of love or social justice is no more logical than the conclusion to hate or destroy. These two sets of beliefs, in a thoroughgoing scientific materialism and in a liberal humanism, simply do not fit with one another. Each set of beliefs is evidence against the other, Tim Keller says in Making Sense of God. So what does this mean? Our culture confuses love as agreement and grace as endorsement. But you see, Christianity is the only worldview that can ground those ideas, that can ground true respect, and what a lot of people mistranslate as tolerance. You see, Christianity is the most inclusive, exclusive truth in the world. Well, what do I mean by that? In John's biography of Jesus' life, we have this short interaction between Jesus and one of his immediate disciples, Thomas. Thomas approaches Jesus in despair because Jesus has just been talking of his leaving and ultimately his betrayal and prediction of his own death. Thomas expresses almost exasperatedly, "Lord," he says, "we don't know where you are going." In response, with compassion, Jesus looks gently at Thomas and says these words: "I am the way, the truth, and the life." In other words, Jesus is saying all those things that you are looking for: peace, hope, acceptance, relationship. All of those things can be yours, Thomas, through me. Do not let your hearts be troubled. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And of course, Jesus says, everyone is invited. It's not about whether you're smart enough or holy enough, whether you have your life together at the moment, whether you're from Ontario or not. I'm from Toronto. Jesus says, lay those things down. Let them go and come to me. Now, if this is an exclusive claim, which it is, I would argue that it's the most inclusive, exclusive truth in the world. Because the heart of the Christian worldview is an invitation. Not one that says, we tolerate who you are, but one that says that you have an invitation because it understands who you are. Not an acceptance in spite of who you are, but an invitation because of who you are. It is an invitation that understands where you're at, your struggles, your hurts, your pains. Jesus says he is the way, he is the truth, and he is the life. Come to me and find rest. Thank you.